Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first of our 3 evening public talk events as part of SeaTember. We're delighted to have you join us for this event. My name is Chris Leakey. I work for MASTS, which is the Marine Alliance for Science and Technology for Scotland. This is a membership body for the majority of Scotland's marine science capacity across universities and public bodies. We're hosting this event together with SAGES, the Scottish Alliance for Geoscience, Environment and Society. We like long titles. SAGES is a similar organisation to MASTS, but for subtly different scientific disciplines. Before we get started, I just got a few housekeeping points. While we have the talk from Tavis, please add any questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll put them to Tavis at the end. It helps us to get ready if you can put your questions in as you think of them while the talk is happening. If you've any problems, you can ask for help. Please use the chat function for that to reach out, and we'll do our best to help. This whole session is being recorded and will be made available on the SAGES YouTube channel afterwards, so you'll be able to revisit it or share it with others. So, as I said, this is one of the events in SeaTember. It's a month of ocean-themed events to engage everyone with our fantastic seas. And the timing is relevant. We're holding this in the run-up to COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, to be held in Glasgow in November. So this is a pivotal moment in humanity's response to the climate emergency and all the issues that surround it. And as science organisations, we want to do what we can to help anyone and everyone feel informed about the issues. As well as MASTS and SAGES, we're also working with Dynamic Earth on this. That's the fantastic Science Visitor Centre experience in Edinburgh. These events are all about the excitement and the challenge of finding scientific solutions to climate change, all with an ocean flavour. The event series spans the globe from the Arctic to the Antarctic to engage people in the scientific research that's going on today. So if you'd like to find out about future events, please sign up on the mailing list link in the chat. Within the bigger programme, this is the first of 3 public talks. After Tavis, there would be lots of time for questions. So for this first event on energy and the just transition to net zero, we're delighted to welcome Professor Tavis Potts to the virtual stage. Tavis is Chair in Sustainable Development and Director of the Centre for Energy Transition at the University of Aberdeen. His research is diverse, from policy and social innovation and environmental governance to the interface between society and natural resources, to just transitions in energy and the governance of the marine economy, or the blue economy, as we sometimes call it. Of particular interest and relevance here today is how just transitions are interpreted and implemented into practice, and therefore the politics of energy and resources. Over to Tavis.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Hannah, and to SAGES and MASTS for the opportunity to present to this intimate group this evening. And so I'm happy to have it as a conversation and pick up questions as we go through. I've had the pleasure of working with both MASTS and SAGES as well over the last sort of period of years. Feels like a decade, maybe not that long, but I've worked with both organizations, so it's great to bring the organizations together in this seminar series. So this is a really important topic and a very relevant topic to around the ideas of a just transition and what a just transition is. So I'm going to present my slides now, share my screen. We'll kick off the talk. Share that and the Zoom screen is blocking my expand button. There we go. There it is. Okay. Chris, you can give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen okay.
I can.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I'm literally just out of the Scottish Parliament, well, watching the Scottish Parliament online, where the debate finished at 6:45 about the just transition and what it means for Aberdeen, actually. So this is, you couldn't get more relevant, I think, of this tonight, where the debate was over the future of St. Fittick's Park, a part of a green belt of Aberdeen, and where there is a proposed development for an energy transition zone. So you couldn't get a more classic example interpretation of just transition in practice, literally in the Parliament 15 minutes ago. But we often think of the just transition as a terrestrial idea, but it's one that I hope I can convince you this evening of. It's very much has a marine focus. In fact, we often talk about the connections between land and sea and people and sea, and of course the just transition is present both in the marine environment and the interconnected coastal and terrestrial environment. Just some pictures of old and new here. This is the Miners' Day March in 1982, when I was 7, in Kirkcaldy, around job losses in the coal fields in Fife. On the right-hand side is when we could march, 2019 climate marches, and very much you can see by this picture orientating around this idea of jobs and secure jobs and job opportunities and the green economy. And we haven't always got this process right. In fact, it's really only now in the modern era where we're actively considering how the process unfolds. And in the past, in many cases around the world, but particularly in the UK, whether it's the shipyards in Glasgow or the coal mines of Fife, that there have been actually unjust transitions where there's been decades of entrenched poverty, structural unemployment, social decline and conflict as a result of a non-planned process. And this is clearly something we want to avoid in the energy transition and the broader societal transition to net zero. And we do have issues around now, particularly in COVID, with issues around youth unemployment and issues around the economy, where we need to think through the process of how we do this. And my point here is that the process of transition is as critical as the outputs, as the outcomes, where the need to include fairness and inclusion and accountability in every step. Switch to a picture of my town where I live here up in Aberdeen, in the northeast of Scotland, and a picture of the past, the present, and potentially the future. Transition is a shift from one social and economic system to another social and economic system based on various drivers and social, political, and economic forces. And in this case, what we're facing around the world is the transition out of high carbon energy sources and a transition into renewables and a low carbon society. But it's more than that. It's more than a technical approach. It's about a world where all jobs are green and decent, and poverty is eradicated, and communities are thriving and resilient, and biodiversity is restored. The transitions aren't new. So in this picture, we see sort of 3 transitions in Aberdeen. We see Aberdeen as it is now, at the center of servicing the oil and gas sector, the energy capital of Europe, and Aberdeen as it was in the past, with a very large pelagic fishing fleet, where fisheries dominated the economy and still very much a strong part of the economy in the northeast. And then this future where we see Aberdeen in the northeast and Scotland as a powerhouse for renewable energy. So these are the transitions, represent social transformations over time, and these have implications for people and communities. So just some quick definitions on the background of some nice artwork here. The literature is awash with definitions of a just transition. You'll find on Google 100 different definitions of what it means, but there are some commonalities here, and those are, I've bolded them in these definitions. So our semi-official definition from the Scottish government, we're one of the only countries in the world to have a Just Transition Commission, which recently reported this year, and we now have a Just Transition Minister, Richard Lochhead, as well. This definition is around governments designing policies where essentially the benefits of climate action are shared widely. They don't accrue to a few select groups or elite groups, while the costs of action don't actually impact those who are at least able to pay or at least able to adapt, or whose livelihoods are at risk as we change. Another more social justice, I guess, approach to just transition from the US is a vision-led and unifying and place-based, contextual set of principles, processes, and practices. This definition is very much about shifting economic and political power from an extractive to a regenerative economy, from centralized power to distributed and community power. And the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which has been thinking about just transition movements for over 30 years, states that a transition towards an environmentally sustainable economy needs to be well managed and contribute to decent work and social inclusion and the eradication of poverty. So you see these intersections of themes come over and over again with different definitions about sharing benefits, about ensuring that people are not excluded, that the process is fair, that the impacts don't fall disproportionately on those least able to pay, that it's about workforces and that are changing and protecting and supporting those workforces that are changing, but it's also about communities and the role of communities and the importance of communities going forward. And I won't labor these points too much, but of course in the academic literature there are a whole range of explanatory frameworks. This is one recently that's come out of Glasgow, the work of Rachel Bray and Rebecca Ford, Strathclyde, who developed this what's called a points framework. And there are some very common elements here around social justice here. So just transition draws very, very heavily on these ideas of climate justice, where climate change is expressed not only as a technical or scientific issue, but a human issue, a social issue, a cultural issue. And also energy justice as well is a very strong theme within a just transition. So where we have things such as distributional, recognition, procedural, and restorative justice, or where do injustices lie spatially? Who is affected? Recognition justice, who is affected by the changes? And procedural, how can they be overcome? Are proper due processes in place that are accessible? And restorative, what can we do to change past injustices and mitigate against future injustices? So very heavily focused on the idea of justice across society over time at different scales. This is another framework which I found recently, which is very much a social justice framework around just transition. So maybe slightly different to what you'd find in the ILO, for example. A very interesting conceptual view of transitions, where through a social activism lens. So moving from, on the left, an extractive economy, where there is a worldview of consumerism and extractive linear industries and exploitation and elitism and enclosures of wealth, through to a regenerative economy where there are different values such as caring and sacredness and regeneration, partnership, democracy, and well-being, and very much through the filter of changing institutions and rules to draw power down into communities and to address issues such as social justice. So another very interesting view, and these are all complementary, these different frameworks. The Scottish government, very joy to this report of the Just Transition Commission, has reported back in March this year, and is now this has gone on to then influence the new role of a minister for just transition in the Scottish government, and it really identifies 4 areas, key points of how a just transition is relevant to Scotland. And and 4 challenges or 4 objectives that it states and goes into more detail in the report. But to pursue a managed transition, so this is one that is solely at the mercy of market forces, for example. This is one that is planned, that is orderly, that actually recognizes that unplanned transitions are incredibly damaging to people and the economy, and that skills and education are key elements here of training and upskilling and reskilling communities, and giving them the education they need so they can adapt, so they can benefit from the transition and not be passive recipients of the transition. It also acknowledges that it's to empower and invigorate our communities, which is a really important inclusion. And then this idea of sharing the benefits widely, and that the burdens are distributed on the basis of ability to pay. But again, the question is, how do we operationalize this in the marine context or in the societal context within Scotland? So I want to switch to the blue economy, and just some brief points about that as we go through what it is, and particularly with a focus on the role of offshore wind as one of the key features of the blue economy. It's not the only feature of the blue economy, of course, but this is the focus of the talk, to bound that. So, well, we know that a growing number of countries are declaring objectives around net zero, this idea of net zero, of balancing our emissions with removal and sequestration of emissions, mostly around the date of 2050. Most of these objectives are in the form of policy statements or softer statements, rather than strict legal commitments, and the UK is one of the few countries in the world that's actually made a legal commitment to net zero. It's very exciting for us. And in the UK, it's to achieve net zero by 2050, and in Scotland is to achieve it by 2045. And just a very general point that the ocean, the role of the ocean and the coasts is in delivering or achieving net zero and a decarbonized system is absolutely central to that vision. In fact, the ocean is going to be center stage in moving forward on this societal mission. Now, at the moment, I'm arguing that things like ocean energy and even offshore wind is a relatively minor player in the energy system as it currently stands. But there's increasing attention on this, on ocean renewable technologies. So I mean offshore wind, and I mean wave and tidal, as a means to diversify power generation, and that's going to create a more ambitious role as we go forward. So recently there was a very controversial, forward-looking, ambitious report by the International Energy Agency, usually quite a conservative organization, but they've brought out an absolute bombshell of a report recently, which talked about, you might have heard the forecast or the call that they made that there should be no more new development of oil and gas from 2021 going forward. And this report has emphasized the need for, in parallel, lowering demand for oil and gas and radically increasing the supply from renewable energy, an overhaul and a radical transformation of the energy system, a ramping up of our global net zero targets. And essentially, under this scenario, it's not the only scenario, there are many competing scenarios out there in the energy industry and even within the IEA going forward. But renewables need to grow threefold, from about 3,000 gigawatts of installed capacity in 2020 to about 10,000 gigawatts by 2030. So a global tripling in the next 9 years. And then again, doubling and then some to 26,000 gigawatts by 2050, providing 88% of total global power generation. Huge increase in capacity. At the moment in 2020, that 3,000 gigawatts is dominated actually by hydro, with about 1,100 gigawatts of capacity. Onshore wind, which is the dominant wind industry, and solar, both for about 700 gigawatts of capacity. Now, by comparison, in terms of ocean energy, it's relatively small at present. Offshore wind, even though the UK is at the heart of the global industry, in fact, is the leader of the global industry, current installed wind capacity is 34 gigawatts capacity, or 1.2% of current power production. And even smaller, wave and tidal is 0.5 gigawatts, or 0.01%. So very relatively minor contributions of marine energy at present to the system. But that is going to change dramatically, particularly over the next nine years up to 2030, and then going up again in intensity as we move towards 2050. So I've highlighted within the UK context some of the boxes in blue, which I think have a marine element to them. So by going forward to 2050, we're going to have to at least double or quadruple electrical capacity as we increasingly electrify the energy system, whether that is through electric vehicles and mobility, or electricity in providing heat and heat pumps to our homes, or electrical capacity powering industry. There's going to be a wholesale increase in electrical capacity. We've heard the target from the UK government, where offshore wind will be 40 gigawatts by 2030. There's currently 10 gigawatts and 1 gigawatt in Scotland. So a quadrupling of offshore wind in the next 9 years. And other industries such as carbon capture and storage, which essentially is sequestering zero at the moment, but very ambitious plans to develop 10 million tons of carbon capture by 2030. The hydrogen economy as a vector, as a way to move and store and transport energy, a very versatile approach to energy. We're producing virtually none at the moment. To deliver 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen in the next 9 years. And of course, the just transition as well for workers in employment and in energy industries and communities. So we're going to see the ocean become center stage over the next 9 years. Just some stats about offshore wind, placing this into context. So as I said, offshore wind globally is about 1% of current electrical production. It's a very minor player, but the UK is the world leader in offshore wind. It has about 11 gigawatts or 11,000 megawatts connected, about 2,300 individual turbines in place in the sea. You can see by the map here the clustering. I don't know if you can see my mouse on the screen, but the clustering of this in the southern areas of the North Sea, and in the Channel, and in Germany, Holland, and around into some areas of the Baltic are the concentrations of the offshore wind industry. That map's going to change quite a lot over the next 10 years as nearly all coastal states in Europe have plans for future development of offshore and floating wind. Just some quick graphs. I won't kind of bamboozle you with the data, but the chart on the left is showing at a European level, or for Europe. This is from Wind Europe, this data, and it shows here it's generally the addition on year capacity of wind. This is both terrestrial and offshore wind. So the dark blue is the terrestrial wind. These light blue caps are offshore wind. So relatively stable, about between 12 and 16 gigawatts every year being added into the system. And a small proportion of that is offshore, but heavily dominated by onshore wind, which in historically at least is been cheaper to install. Now, if we just take those little light blue caps, and they're transposed onto the graph on the right hand side. So that's just offshore wind, and this red line shows the growing capacity of offshore wind. So now in Europe there's about 25 gigawatts cumulative of offshore wind capacity. and that's growing. Now, if you think just back to what the UK target is, the UK just on its own is planning to have 40 gigawatts installed in the next 9 years. So a huge aspect there on the seas. And looking forward to 2050, we're using generation in terawatt hours here, so actual generation rather than installed capacity. But the message from this graph, those blue parts are wind energy, again, onshore wind and offshore wind. But wind energy will be the center, the core, 50% of the European power production system going forward by 2050. So you'll see coal disappear. You'll see oil decline substantially. There will be a consistent role for nuclear energy, but the huge growth that's coming is going to be from wind, and a big part of that will be onshore wind. So they're the figures: 253 gigawatts by 2030, and 70 gigawatts of that is offshore wind. Remember, UK is on itself is doing 40 gigawatts by 2030. So massive changes coming in ocean energy going forward. Now, in terms of what does this mean in terms of a just transition and some of the principles we saw in the just transition? I've adapted this from a paper on just transition in the financial sector, and I like it how it talks about different groups of society here. So it talks about workers, communities, consumers, and citizens. And some of the aspects we need to consider in terms of the blue economy is in terms of the workforce, so diversifying the economy, how we transition the economy from, say, the oil and gas and energy jobs into, say, wind or hydrogen production or carbon capture and storage. How we do this via developing new skills and training, the role of things such as social protection. So this transfer of the workforce isn't just done by the market, but actually is done by supporting people and supporting their training, and addressing things like labor market inequalities. In terms of communities, we need to understand what are the spillover effects of the blue economy, because it isn't a neutral concept, certainly as we've seen by sort of conflicts such as St. Fittick's Park and other parts of around Scotland, that the development of the offshore economy is not neutral, and that it can cause conflicts between sectors and between marine and coastal and terrestrial communities. And we need to address this issue in terms of revitalization of coastal communities, where coastal communities, we have some stats, which I'll show later on, where actually many examples where coastal communities are incredibly deprived areas. And when there's a real major call here for how we actually revitalize communities using the energy system. Other aspects such as ownership of energy, ownership of infrastructure, and community energy systems. In terms of consumers, and of course, communities and citizens and workers are all part of society. In terms of just looking at consumers, and this is not necessarily just in coastal communities, but fairness, ensuring that, there are major debates around fairness at the moment, with dramatically increasing electricity costs, for example, going forward. Fuel poverty, which is endemic in Scotland, a real problem, both in urban and rural environments. Things like prosumer movements, so people producing and selling their energy from their home, from their electric vehicle, otherwise, as opposed to just being passive recipients of energy. And citizens, so this involves inclusion and participation and direct democracy, working within structures such as marine spatial planning and reforming those structures and creating community wealth. These are all elements of a just transition that we need to consider. In terms of employment in these sectors, actually most employment in the low carbon sector is in energy efficiency at the moment. So there's a comparison between the last 3 years of data, so 2015 and 2018. So actually most employment in the sector is in as in energy efficiency. This is building of energy efficiency products and lighting, homes, walls, insulation, things like that. And it's far by the most dominant category of employment actually in the green economy at present. And you can see offshore wind is down here. So it's growing from 2015 to 2018. But if we're talking about jobs as a key part of the just transition, then there are relatively minor contributions of jobs at present in the sector. And we need to look at jobs across the whole of the green economy rather than a specific subsector of it. I graphed out for this the trajectory of jobs, particularly in offshore wind, as this is going to be a key part of transitioning oil and gas workers into the economy. And there is, it's growing, but it's also quite stagnant. It hasn't really shifted substantially since 2017. The data only goes up in the Office of National Statistics to 2019. These are the different UK nations. So blue is England, orange is England, blue is the UK overall. So an increase in jobs and then a leveling off of jobs. But Scotland actually has gone backwards on jobs in offshore wind from 2017 to 2019. Certainly statistics that the government might not be too impressed with, considering the increasing rhetoric and discussion about offshore wind. So we need to do more about here of creating new jobs in the sector. There's a lot on this slide, but I want to take you through it because it's quite interesting, quite important. So it kind of reflects issues about style over substance and how we must actually dig deeper into the social implications of change. So on the left, this is work by Robert Gordon University in May this year. So in 2021, according to the modeling here, there are approximately 160,000 jobs in the offshore energy workforce. And the purple here, you can see, is dominated by oil and gas. And then offshore wind has about 26,000 jobs, but this is direct and indirect jobs. So the previous data was direct jobs only. So those with direct involvement in the industry, as opposed to indirect jobs, which are more about the broader supply chain. And then by 2030, you're going to see an increase in offshore jobs overall, but a halving of jobs in oil and gas. So you're going to see this huge expansion in offshore wind. So upwards here of, I think it's approximately about 70 to 80,000 jobs across the UK in the offshore wind sector. But if we just go back a few slides, then really at the moment, we're looking at probably about just over 7,000 jobs. So in 9 years' time, are we really going to expand, tenfold? That is a major challenge and quite ambitious, I would say. So huge ambitions, and modeling and policy is always very ambitious in looking at the jobs. When you look at the actual data, it's a little bit not as big as the forecasts often make out. On the right hand side, there's some huge challenges, because just transition isn't just about job numbers. It's not a numbers game. It's actually about who has access to the jobs, where those jobs are distributed, and the quality of those jobs. So, for example, what I find personally to be an absolutely horrifying statistic, that currently in the offshore wind workforce, we have a gender balance of 18% of women and 79% of men. Now, this is an industry which is supposed to be all about sustainability, right? I think that is a deplorable statistic and something you really, really have to work on. It's even worse if you're from a Black, Asian or Middle Eastern background, with 3% representation in the offshore wind industry and 97% of white workers in the industry. So again, it's not just about more jobs, it's about who is working in the industry and the diversity in the industry. It is not just as expressed by the COP26 Universities Network. It's not just having a low carbon society of the current society we got. That is not what a just transition is about. It is about justice and restoration and recognition and diversification and access to jobs and addressing some of the social injustices of the past. This is a quote from, I'm in my final few slides here. This is a quote from the Scottish Government's Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan. Yes, Chris, we love big titles. Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan, which is essentially the key strategy for the Scottish Government for climate skills. And this is a direct quote here, that the benefits of the transition actually will likely remain skewed towards certain groups, socioeconomic groups, those that are wealthy or adaptable or who have good education. Unless it's proactively addressed. and critical sectors of the energy economy are male dominated with underrepresentation. We saw that in the previous slide. And also those in lower skilled and low income and unstable groups are less likely actually to be able to take advantage of these opportunities. So this is where the social justice dimensions of the just transition come in, are very important. This picture is from the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. Aberdeen is one of the wealthiest cities in the UK, but that wealth is concentrated into a particular geographical space in the West End of Aberdeen, where most of these energy jobs, particularly the professional, highly skilled jobs, are concentrated. And yet we have huge areas of social deprivation and poverty around the city that have not been served well by the energy economy to historically and up to the current date. And so a just transition is very much about how do we diversify these opportunities and create new opportunities for those who would not normally have them in the energy industry and the green economy more generally. We have some genuine concerns about the progress of the just transition. And even just this week, on the bottom right-hand side here, they essentially Scotland's only wind turbine factory closed in Campbelltown. There are major concerns from organised labour, from the unions in general, about the boom in wind is actually outsourcing, particularly manufacturing jobs overseas. So major opportunities for construction of wind farms are actually being built by companies. For example, an American company, General Electric, and Dutch companies are going to be building one of the key sites off the east coast of Scotland, not produced and manufactured in Scotland. Again, this feeds into this overall jobs, the number of jobs and the quality of jobs that are happening. So it's not all bad news. The BIFAB factory that did close down was reopened again, and on the basis of securing one of the contracts for manufacturing the footings of one of the wind farms. But in order to have a just transition, we need to be able to manufacture things here in the UK as one of the key strategies in developing more jobs in the sector. This slightly complicated slide, as I wind up, is a map of all the current plans of wind farms around the coast of the UK. Those both in planning in red. Most of them are in planning or are in have just been gained consent but haven't actually been constructed. The green are under construction or fully commissioned. So the picture is here of one of a very busy marine environment going forward, enormous opportunities. But those opportunities have to involve not only servicing those industries through the energy service sector, but also the construction and the building and the fabrication of those industries if we're going to have a just transition. The picture on the left is a declining coastal community. And what a just transition needs to do is connect the two. The boom in offshore energy, the boom in wind, that's going to be at the heart of the energy transition, with actually the restoration and the revitalization of coastal communities. And the Social Market Foundation 2019 produced some very, and I'm surprised this was not taken up more widely in the marine policy community in the UK, where we have some terrifying statistics about coastal communities. For example, wage gaps are hugely significantly different between coastal communities and with communities in general. The average pay in coastal communities is about £4,700 in the rest of Great Britain in 2018. And that's getting wider. And that coastal communities have seen weaker economic growth than other parts of the company. So they only grew by 7.5% between 2010 and 2017, where the rest of the economy grew by 17%. So again, what is going on with coastal communities? And if we're going to consider a just transition in the marine economy, that has to really sit about how we revitalize coastal communities. Access to services, to jobs is more limited in coastal communities. And yet, as we can see, just by offshore wind, and there are other sectors to consider, are all going to be in proximity to coastal communities. So we have to be a lot more aggressive and innovative in tackling this problem. And the report also points out some very concerning data on a widening life expectancy gap between coastal communities and the rest of Britain. So we often talk about natural capital and well-being and the importance of UK and Scottish coasts for as reservoirs of natural capital that improve our health and quality of life. Yet in many parts of the coast, there's a widening gap of life expectancy as we are not harnessing or using that natural capital to support well-being. So really concerning statistics that we have to address. My last slide to finish off is how would I summarize this? Some of the key challenges for a just transition in the coastal and the marine environment. I'd say there's 3 areas that we have to look at. I'm trying to cut through some of the jargon around this. Net zero jobs, skills and training. So we need to diversify the ocean industries. We need to look at how we can transition the oil and gas workforce into offshore wind and ocean energy and other industries such as carbon capture and hydrogen and decommissioning, all areas of growth, but this won't happen passively, particularly if we want to actually encourage diversification or an accessibility in the workforce. We need to invest in skills and training across the economy, not just in industries, not just in more elite groups and well-off groups, but actually climate literacy for small businesses, training for small businesses across the economy, training and skills around net zero and how to achieve that. We need to address accessibility and diversity and the geographical spread of opportunities and look at the fair distribution of benefits, because it's currently not fair. We need to address coastal community revitalization as one of the key planks of a just transition. This includes the ownership of assets, community ownership of assets, both land assets and coastal assets such as green space, but also things such as energy infrastructure assets and community energy schemes. We need to recognize tenure and sea use, both traditional tenure up against as we increasingly privatize the oceans. I draw upon some of the work of Sandy Kerr from Harriet Watt, looking at privatization of ocean space is an increasing problem. We need to better understand the nature of community benefit from offshore wind and look at how that system is performing and are there genuine benefits accruing back to communities, such as in the provision of infrastructure. We need targeted and direct investment to address social marginalization and disadvantage in communities. We need to explore social innovation as much as we do technical and industrial innovation, and we need to continually enhance and use natural capital. On the final point, I think the major challenge for a just transition is about how we build in and advance and innovate around participation and inclusion and move from the lowest rung of Einstein's ladder, consultation, up through into empowerment of communities. So how do we empower voices? And we have examples from things such as the growing movements around citizen assemblies, for example. But can we actually empower the voices and the recommendations out of citizen assemblies to make real changes in policy and in planning? That's a very tough question. We need to have interventions in coastal communities determined by those coastal communities themselves, not imposed from outside. So more direct democracy, for example. We need to have increased capacity, representation and participation in marine spatial planning. In fact, we need to have marine spatial planning full stop in Scotland. The process seems to have stalled and has been very slow to roll out, particularly at a regional level. And we have to look at the role of more contextual local scales of marine planning as opposed to maybe the larger, broader national top-down approaches to marine planning that we currently have in Scotland. And we need to continue to develop more forms of co-creation between communities and researchers, and more forms of active action and participatory research in a just transition. A long list of requests there for people and researchers and communities to do. So that's everything for tonight. It's a bit of a grand tour through some of the topics. It's a fascinating topic. It's a really, really important topic. And I'd just like to end by saying that it's the process of transition which is critical, and is the one where we have to get that right. The next 9 years are going to be a critical time for a successful net zero transition, and one that is just, and one that is fair, and one that is inclusive going forward for communities. So thank you for the opportunity to talk. That's my email if you want to get in touch, and happy to take a few questions.
Great, thank you very much, Tavis. I'll let you take your screen down there. So yes, it's absolutely staggering when you start to think about the magnitude of some of the changes that are coming, actually, when you see those maps and graphs. So we've got a few questions have come in, and we'll just, if anybody has any more, please throw them in the Q&A box, but I'll start working through these. So first of all, interesting to note that the UK is a leader in wind energy. Why do you think that is? And do we have expertise that we could use to be a technical lead across the world?
Absolutely. It used to be Denmark who was the leader, but the UK has well and truly overtaken both Denmark and Germany now in offshore wind. So basically, the UK took a punt a number of years ago about in public subsidy into the offshore wind sector, primarily through looking at the contracts for difference and subsidization of the sector. Now that has really paid off, because what it did was launch or grow an innovation boom around offshore wind. And we have seen, as a result, the cost of offshore wind, if you look at a graph of the levelized cost of energy for different energy sources, the cost of offshore wind has dropped dramatically over the past sort of 7 or 8 years. But that took some very ambitious public subsidy to get us to that point. And so there's a genuine role there for subsidy to do that. Now that subsidy came from us, actually, from you and me. It came through our power bills. And we paid through our power bills into to subsidizing the offshore renewable industry. And there's now talks of, I saw there's a paper that was published in Nature just a few weeks ago about negative subsidies from the offshore wind sector, where the sector may start to pay back some of that subsidy because it's so cheap, back into, well, at least the tax pot, but maybe to the consumer. So it has a real role for carefully invested public funds into supporting new industries. We're probably going to go through the same process with hydrogen, for example. Although there is a massive global competition around hydrogen, both green and blue hydrogen, so hydrogen from gas and hydrogen from, say, wind and electrolysis. But again, we're facing the same problem in that we may be innovating around the industry of hydrogen, and we have innovated around the industry of wind and the cost of it, but we're not manufacturing it here in the UK. We're not building electrolyzers for hydrogen. We're not building turbines, towers, and blades. The main factories in Hull, in the Humber in UK for that, and that's done huge amounts of employment benefits for the community of Hull. So if we want those, we have dropped the cost, but if we want those job benefits, we have to have a full service industry that is about manufacturing and installation and service and monitoring and management going forward. But it's a success story, and we should be exporting that to the rest of the world.
Great, thank you. I mean, that's good news. I'm certainly looking forward to getting some of the money back.
Yeah, me too.
So, well, you've just made me think, I suppose. We've been talking about, offshore wind, and you've mentioned hydrogen as a growth area too. What about wave and tidal? Are we in a similar sort of leadership role when it comes to wave and tidal energy? Where are those industries at in broad terms?
I would say they're about 10 years behind where we are, where we're with offshore wind now. I think we have the capacity to develop those industries. We are in the, I think it's the top 3, I believe, in the world for tidal. The leader in terms of, at least in terms of installed capacity, and there's probably a debate of, you know, if installed capacity makes you a world leader or not. There's other indicators you could, which don't have on top of this evening, but South Korea has the highest capacity for tidal at the moment, mainly because they have a very big one, single a tidal plant in South Korea, but it's closely followed by the UK actually, and we are seeing more and more development of an installation of tidal turbines. They are a minor role in terms of electricity production at the moment. They also suffer from some of the problems with the grid and the cost of accessing the grid, particularly in remote areas. But as we move towards potentially a decentralized energy system, and this is a big debate in the energy sector, that we should also be looking at decentralized forms of energy production as well as centralized and industrial forms of energy production, because I think decentralized forms of energy production can have a much stronger just transitions effect, where they can be owned directly by communities. For example, they can feed the benefits of both the tariffs and the power directly into communities, and they can support diverse community energy systems where they work hand in hand, say, with a hydrogen production, bioenergy production, and small scale community owned wind production as well. So I think, while it's a relatively minor contribution, it can have actually a major impact on coastal communities, and that's something we certainly need to consider, particularly on places like Orkney and Shetland and the Western Isles and the West Coast that have very good tidal resource.
Great, thank you very much. You've actually anticipated one of the other questions, so I'm going to pass over that. And someone was very interested in your stat about why there's so few women being in offshore industry. Not a surprise, perhaps, given the culture but the question is, what are the benefits of greater equality? Are there particular examples that show benefits of diversity in energy transitions?
It's a really good question. There are a more diverse workforce in general. I don't have the figures to hand, is a much more innovative workforce. You bring different ideas to the table. There's a lot more support for different forms of working and employment, for example. You get a much more stable workforce, for example. You get one that is inclusive and diverse. So I think there are a lot of very good reasons for doing this. The oil and gas industry is also having major problems with diversification as well. It's not just renewables. But the oil and gas industry is actually having a lot of discussions about this. In fact, there was only a conference on this week about things such as offshore protective equipment, and how even the equipment that is used, or the facilities that are housed in offshore rigs, are actually very discriminatory for getting women involved in the workforce. So I think there are a lot of good reasons for doing that, for a diverse workforce, a workforce that is more innovative, that can create and share and bring different ideas to the table, can have different approaches to management. We need to diversify this, particularly if we have the ambitions for jobs that's been cited in a number of the slides I produced today. We have to bring everyone on board on this journey. It also is about how you distribute the wealth and the income from these sectors as well, and how you grow communities. And I think the diversity, I don't have any data on this, but I think a much more diverse workforce. We'll be able to distribute income and grow communities in a much more effective way. That's probably more of a challenge or a question, but it's a really good question. It's not an easy one.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, yeah, gender diversity. I suppose maybe the military might be an example that's been through some of that. Maybe there's some experience there.
And in leadership, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Just a couple more questions here, I think, and then we'll wrap up, I think, on time. You mentioned the life expectancy gap between coastal communities and the rest of the UK. What could you expand a little on that? What's the reason for that, do you think?
As I can only really speculate on that because I don't have the report or the data to hand. I think if you look at a whole range of issues around social deprivation are more pronounced in coastal communities. So, for example, a lack of access to key services is a common feature. You don't have access to as good or quality jobs or stable jobs, for example. In many coastal communities, there are issues with health, with higher levels of isolation, higher levels of drug abuse, higher issues, higher levels around mental health and isolation. So you add all these things up, and that turns into this. I mean, for me, it's an astounding statistic, both in terms of life expectancy and income and economic development in coastal regions, because those of us who work in topics like such as natural capital and ecosystem services always talk about how the coast is a reservoir of blue health and blue well-being. But well, if that's the case, then why do we have these entrenched social and economic problems? There are also places that have faced substantial industrial decline, for example, or haven't really had a solution. The whole levelling up agenda of the government is in part about restoring coastal communities. So places like Blackpool are a very good example with very high levels of social deprivation and loss of traditional industries, but with no real replacement for those. So yeah, it's I think that's, if anything is a key part of a just transition, it's the revitalization of coastal communities, but it has to be done on the terms that are decided, on the interventions that are decided by those communities. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as a social researcher, and I don't want to give away my master's talk too much, but is how we position ourselves as social researchers, as not telling communities to what to do, but actually being able to empower and provide resources and facilitate what communities want, driven by them. And that's kind of a real key role that we can play.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you one very last short question, which you can give a short answer to. And imagine this is your elevator pitch to a coastal community. So I'm just conscious that there are lots of coastal communities out there that are chomping at the bit for, solutions to climate change and, to be able to contribute to net zero. What can coastal communities themselves do? What can they take the initiative on to help things along for a just transition?
Can I use my own community as an example?
Absolutely.
So we have a brand new climate change action group in our local coastal community, Newborough, north of Aberdeen and the Ithen Estuary. What we lack actually is information on how we join the dots together. So how we can attract funding, how we can build our own local energy system, how we can build our own local transport system, how we can transform our green spaces and protect our green spaces. So it's information and money and resources, and able to convert those into real action, to actually take what we want and have a process where we can capture what we want, whether it's through citizens' assemblies or any other way, and transform that into real action. Because there are a lot of blocks out there. There's a lot of competing information or different information. There's a lot of blocks in governance and local government and institutions and in planning barriers that communities face. So it's actually bringing everything together and transforming that into real action.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's a nice take home.
And I hate elevator pitches. I'm terrible at them.
Well, thank you very much, Tavis. That's been very interesting. And thank you to everyone that joined us this evening. Before we sign off, just a reminder, you can get on the mailing list for future events in what remains of this September SeaTember series. The next talk is next Wednesday. It's about nature-based solutions, and it's by Katie Gillam from Nature Scott. So please join us for that. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.